We were in the middle of yet another argument, one of those pointless fights that had become more frequent lately. It started over something trivial. I asked if she wanted to spend time together that evening. I thought I was being considerate, offering to set aside work and distractions to focus on us. But instead of appreciation, I got a sharp, dismissive response. Her tone was cold, almost rehearsed. "I don't owe you intimacy," she said, arms crossed, eyes locked on me like she was daring me to challenge her words. At first, I thought, I misheard her. I blinked, trying to process what had just come out of her mouth. "What?" I half laughed, half panicked. "What does that even mean?" She didn't flinch. "It means exactly what it sounds like," she snapped. "I'm tired of you acting like it's some kind of obligation. Just because we're married doesn't mean I owe you anything." It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under. Me. 8 years. 8 years of sacrifices, late nights, and working overtime to give us the life we had. And now she was telling me, plain as day, that my feelings and needs didn't matter. That the foundation of our marriage, trust, intimacy, partnership was apparently optional. I wanted to argue, to tell her how much that hurt, how rejected I felt, but the words wouldn't come. I just stood there staring at her, like a stranger had suddenly appeared in my wife's body. The fight didn't last much longer. She walked, out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts racing. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself she was just stressed, having a bad day. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't the first time she'd made me feel like I didn't matter. It was just the first time she'd said it so clearly. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the conversation, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. Had I missed the signs? Had I done something to push her away? Or had I been fooling myself all along, thinking we were still a team? By morning, my frustration had turned into something else. Resolve. If she didn't owe me intimacy, then maybe I didn't owe her the endless sacrifices I'd been making to keep our marriage afloat. I wasn't going to let myself feel like a beggar in my own relationship anymore. I didn't say anything to her right away. Instead, I started paying attention, really paying attention, to how we interacted, how she treated me, how little she seemed to care about the effort I put into our life together. And the more I noticed, the more convinced I became that something had to change. But what that change would look like, I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I wasn't going to let her words define my worth. Not anymore. The days after that conversation felt different. Something had shifted inside me. I started seeing our marriage through a new lens, not as a partnership, but as a constant balancing act where I was always the one giving more to keep things steady. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I thought about the long nights I spent working overtime so we could afford the down payment on our house. Back then, she told me how proud she was, how lucky she felt to have someone who cared so much about our future. I held on to those words like fuel, pushing myself harder because I believed I was doing it for us. But now, looking back, I couldn't help but feel like I'd been tricked, like my sacrifices had been quietly erased the moment they stopped being convenient for her. And it wasn't just the big things, it was the small, everyday moments. The nights I canceled plans with friends because she needed me at home. The weekends spent fixing things around the house or running errands to make her life easier. The times I stayed up listening to her vent about work because I didn't want her to feel alone. Intimacy wasn't just about sex. For me, it was about feeling connected, valued, knowing that the effort I put in wasn't taken for granted. But apparently that was too much to ask. I started keeping track of the imbalance, not on paper, but in my head. Every time she dismissed me. Every time she brushed off something I cared about. Like the night I came home excited about a new project at work and she barely looked up from her phone. Or the time I made her favorite dinner after a stressful week and all I got was a half-hearted thanks before she walked away. I don't think she even noticed the way I was withdrawing. Maybe that was the worst part. How easy it was for her to overlook me when I stopped trying so hard. One night, I sat in my car outside our house, staring at the dark windows, wondering if it was even worth walking inside. It was such a stupid thought. I mean, it was my home too, but I felt like a guest there, like someone whose presence barely registered. I thought about what she said, how she didn't owe me intimacy, and for the first time I let myself ask the question I'd been avoiding. What did she owe me? Respect? Appreciation? Partnership? Or was that just something I had imagined we had? I started thinking about the early days of our relationship, when we couldn't keep our hands off each other, when we talked about everything. I missed that version of us. But the more I tried to picture it, the more it felt like a different lifetime. That night, I didn't go inside right away. I sat there, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, trying to recognize the man, looking back at me. I didn't see the guy who had been full of dreams and plans when we got married. I saw someone tired, someone who had spent years pouring into a relationship that had stopped pouring anything back. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't angry because of what she said. I was angry because deep down I knew she was right. She didn't owe me intimacy, but if that was true, then I didn't owe her the version of myself that had spent years bending over backward to keep us together. That night, as I stepped through the door, I felt different. Not angry, not sad, just done. Done trying to fix. Something she didn't even seem to notice was broken. And as much as that realization hurt, it also gave me a strange sense of clarity. If she didn't owe me intimacy, then maybe I didn't owe her the version of myself that had spent years adjusting, sacrificing, and making things work. So I stopped. The shift started small. I stopped asking how her day was, not out of spite, but because I realized I didn't actually care to hear the same rehearsed complaints about coworkers or deadlines. For once, I let the conversation die instead of always being the one to keep it going. At first, I don't think she even noticed. But as the days passed, I saw it starting to sink in. She started trying, bringing me coffee when I was working late, suggesting we watch a movie together. But instead of jumping at the scraps of attention, I let her efforts hang in the air, unacknowledged, not to punish her, but because I needed to see if it was real, or just another way to smooth things over without addressing the problem. And when she finally asked me, her voice quieter than usual, "Are you mad at me?" I looked at her and said the one thing I had been holding back since that night. "I'm just done trying harder than you." The words hit her like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond, but for once, nothing came out. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had the upper hand. Not because I won some argument, but because I had finally stopped apologizing for wanting more than she was willing to give. At first, it felt like progress. We were talking again, acknowledging the distance instead of ignoring it. She wanted me to come home, to try counseling before we made any final decisions. A part of me wanted that too. But another part, the part that remembered how we got here in the first place, couldn't shake the doubt. I couldn't forget how it felt to be dismissed, to be told my needs didn't matter. I couldn't erase the years of feeling unseen, unheard, taken for granted. And no matter how much she promised to change, I couldn't ignore the fact that it took me walking away for her to start trying at all. So, I didn't rush back. Instead, I set boundaries. Real ones. If we were going to try again, it had to be different. I wasn't going to keep chasing affection or begging for attention. She needed to show me, not just tell me, that she was willing to put in the work. For a while, it seemed like she was. She went to counseling on her own. She admitted fault instead of placing blame. She sent long messages reflecting on the damage done. But something still felt off. Maybe it was the timing, how her effort only began when she realized she was losing me. Or maybe it was the simple truth that I no longer trusted her not to fall back into old patterns once the fear of losing me wore off. In the end, the decision wasn't explosive. There was no dramatic fight, no teary confrontation. Just a quiet acceptance that we had drifted too far apart to ever find our way back. I filed for separation a month later. She didn't fight it. And even though it hurt to close this chapter of my life, I walked away knowing I had finally chosen myself, something I hadn't done in years. Whether it was the right choice or not, only time will tell. But one thing I know for sure: I don't owe anyone more than they're willing to give in return. Not anymore.